Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is @Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am co-host Connor McNamara Stratton.
And today we have a poem called Say Grace by Emily Jungmin Yoon, who was born in Busan, South Korea. She has a book out in 2017 called Ordinary Misfortune, and she'll have a book coming out this year called A Cruelty Special to Our Species. She's had poems in, I believe, The New Yorker, in Poetry Magazine, quite a few different high-profile places. And perhaps most notably, she's the Ruth, Lily, and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship Award recipient from the Poetry Foundation in 2017. So she is a young poet on the rise.
He's killing it. And Ordinary Misfortunes is a chapbook, and Cruelty Special to Our Species will be her first full-length collection.
I don't know that this poem needs any special introduction. So yeah, let's dive right into it. So this is Say Grace by Emily Jungmin Yoon. In my country, our shamans were women, and our gods multiple, until white people brought an ecstasy of rosaries, and our cities today glow with crosses like graveyards. As a child in Sunday school, I was told I'd go to hell if I didn't believe in God. Our teacher was a woman whose daughters wanted to be nuns. And I asked, what about babies? And what about Buddha? And she said, they're in hell too. And so I memorized prayers and recited them in front of women I did not believe in. Deliver us from evil, O sweet Virgin Mary, amen. O sweet, in this country which calls itself Christian, what is sweeter than hearing, have mercy on us, from those who serve different gods? O clement, O loving, O God, amidst ruins, amidst waters, fleeing, deliver us from evil, O sweet, in this country. Point at the moon, at the stars, point at the way the lake lies with a handful of feathers, and they will look at the feathers and kill you for it. If a word for religion they don't believe in is magic, so be it. Let us have magic. Let us have our own mothers and scarves, our spirits, our shamans, and our sacred books. Let us keep our stars to ourselves, and we shall pray to no one. Let us eat what makes us holy.
Such a good one.
Yeah, when I came across this poem, I was instantly engrossed just because it has such a dense thicket of, to me, it seemed primarily gender and religion conversations sort of rubbing up against each other and going all sorts of interesting places. That was what first just really stuck out to me. What's your initial reaction?
Yeah, no, I love this when I read it too. Yeah, and definitely religion and gender are seem very central, and also there's this kind of, which is wrapped up, but the kind of idea of cultural, ethnic, or like national identity.
Mm,
And there seems to be this, the poem seems to be trying to answer this question of like how to sort of honor or reclaim or live out or be true to one's cultural or national or ethnic identity, particularly with respect to religion and gender. And particularly, she's writing, the speaker is in America, presumably. And so there's a kind of, I think it's like how to live in that way when you've been sort of doubly displaced, where in the beginning there's the first displacement of, in my country our shamans were women and our gods multiple, until white people brought an ecstasy of rosaries. So there seems to be a reference to, and this comes up when the speaker asks about Buddha, but South Korea, I think still has a large Buddhist population, and so obviously the Christianity was like an import. I think sort of directly it was an import from China, or somewhat related to their occupation under Japan. But Christianity that came from them originally came from Europe. And then there's that first displacement. And then there's, well, now we're in America that calls itself Christian and don't recognize, what we're pointing at. And so how do we sort of live also within that context? That's kind of like my broad strokes reading of the poem.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot. And I think the poem moves in an interesting way because it does start off talking about in my country, which I think we can take to mean South Korea, and also talks about childhood experiences. So there's a little bit of, when I first read it, it struck me that there's sort of three parts to the poem, which is that first part, which is like the childhood experience. Well, really two experiences. First, what is going on in South Korea, then shifting into this very restrictive vision of Christianity. Then there's this middle section, which is sort of a prayer within the poem. There's parts of the poem that are italicized, indicating speech, as opposed to parts that are not italicized. But this whole middle part, sort of from the beginning of where she says, I prayed to women I did not believe in, right after that, it goes into a literal prayer, but then continues in what seems to be a prayer up to, in this country, point at the moon, at the stars, point at the way the lake lies. So I sort of saw that beginning section, then this prayer section, and then the last third of the poem is almost an adult perspective, naming more directly what the problem is. So you can point to all of this wonder in the world, but if you do it with feathers in your hand, if you have the wrong like base religion underpinning it, which is one that maybe the country does not recognize or agree with, or really isn't Christian sort of in the world of the poem, then what's going to be pointed out is your otherness rather than the truth or the beauty that you may be describing. And then that transitions into her call for what kind of religion or spiritual orientation towards the world she would like to see. So there's like this childhood and young person section, there's this prayer section, and then there's a more adult perspective section in the poem. That would be my sort of quick gloss first reading.
Yeah, no, I think that's really right. And there, alongside that movement, is also this movement from kind of like a very narrative and also like personal sounding first person singular I, to, by the end, this kind of like plural we, and a more sort of lyrical incantation almost. And where we have like in the beginning, as a child in Sunday school, I was told this, and our teacher was a woman, and I asked, what about babies? And she said, so there's kind of like, we're like in scene for a moment. But then by the end, we get this like sort of marvelous, like, if a word for religion they don't believe in is magic, so be it. Let us have magic. Let us have our own mothers. Let us keep our stars to ourselves. Let us eat what makes us holy. And things get, very, I think you're absolutely right, like adult, and also gets like sort of capacious in like a sort of a plural, bringing everyone in, or like not everyone, but everyone who shares this speaker's experience, basically.
Definitely. And in each one of those parts of the poem, and even if you don't think of the poem in those parts, running through the poem, however you have your reading of it, there are women specifically referenced at each juncture. So at first, there's this teacher who is a woman whose daughters wanted to be nuns. And then there's the Virgin Mary within the prayer. And then at the end, there is our own mothers and scarves. And I think the scarves is meant to call to head coverings in Islam. That was my initial connection for that. Whether or not that's the direct reference the poem wants to make, that's what I was thinking of, just in terms of stigmatized female religious presentation in Western societies. I mean, this is probably a good place to just call out again that Connor and I are both cis white dudes, so we enter all of these conversations with an awareness of and our own limitations as a result. But what I was certainly struck by how that theme showed up in this poem, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it.
I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, and certainly our access to the poem is like necessarily sort of an encounter with an experience or an expression of an experience that we sort of don't experience, and a kind of suffering and marginalization that we don't have to undergo in a kind of way. And yeah, and also the shamans in the beginning are women too.
Yes.
So it's very specific, and I think explicit too. It's striking, especially that moment where the teacher whose daughters wanted to be nuns, that the speaker says our teacher was a woman whose daughter wanted to be nuns, and that woman is the last thing in the line, because it's not immediately apparent in sort of like what the conversation is about, that the gender is like sort of important insofar as my like stupid surface reading is that it's an authority figure who's imposing a religious preference on someone who doesn't want that, basically. So it seems like notable, as you pointed out, that the poem is kind of like our teacher was a woman who has daughters, and the daughters want to be nuns, and that she's memorizing the prayers and then later reciting them in front of women I did not believe in. And it's interesting. Yeah, I think I agree with how you are thinking about it, and I am still trying to work through sort of a way to conceptualize it. I mean, in some ways it does seem like, I don't know, the only way that I have a thought about it is that on the one hand, already this poem is like only women in it, and in patriarchal societies, men are obviously exerting dominance and oppression. And it's also interesting that the speaker is not just locating women as the shamans or as, the sort of holy figures, but also as the sort of the teacher, the oppressive teacher, the women that she doesn't believe in. And that seems to be kind of like the dual tension, I guess, is that on the one hand, there's a deliberate creation of this world that is deliberately crafted to exclude men, but then on the other hand is also deliberately naming women as part of the sort of institutional forces that are sort of requiring this imaginative reclaiming that's happening in the poem, I guess. I don't know. That doesn't seem that... Seems like maybe partly right, but I feel like there's more going on.
I mean, that's basically the direction I went with it. It felt sort of like shamans in my country. Our shamans were women. It felt like those shamans were set up sort of in opposition to our teacher was a woman whose daughters wanted to be nuns, speaking to, as you were pointing out, it's this invasive patriarchal society that is so powerful the internalized misogyny of it reaches even this woman and her daughters who want to be nuns. It becomes a self-perpetuating destructive system that is trying to capture our writer. It's trying to make her part of that system. And what this poem then does is really turn into an act of resistance against it, so that by the end, she's saying, let us have our own mothers and scarves, our spirits, our shamans, who we know from the beginning in my country, our shamans were women. So even if it's not explicitly saying empowered female religious figures, shamans can point back to that part from the beginning, our sacred books. Let us eat what makes us holy. This whole end part then sort of looks like a very pointed striking out against that system that tried to ensnare her at an early age. And I really like the line, I memorized prayers and recited them in front of women I did not believe in, because I could see that either being this teacher or even being statues of the Virgin Mary, not knowing the specific beliefs of either the individual in the poem or Emily Jungmin Yoon. But I think it's interesting how that works, and how in Catholicism, a highly patriarchal and restrictive religion in terms of its views of women does have female figures within its scripture, but the purpose to which they are put and the way in which they are framed is often restrictive.
Yeah, that seems right. It's also interesting, and this sort of maybe gets at a little bit of the kind of the parts and the turns that you were mentioning, and also maybe a little bit the way that gender is working a little bit. But I was loving the way that "Oh Sweet" moves and repeats in the poem. So it starts reciting them in front of women I did not believe in. Deliver us from evil, and this is italicized, so it's part of the prayer. Oh, sweet Virgin Mary, amen, which is also italicized, and then oh, sweet, oh, sweet. And so the oh, sweet is this phrase that comes from the prayer that, she doesn't believe in. And then it kind of like takes on a little bit a life of its own when it's repeated, oh, sweet, which is now no longer part of the prayer and is in the speaker. And then at first it's kind of an ironizing word, sweet. In this country which calls itself Christian, what is sweeter than hearing have mercy on us? And I actually have a separate question about that line, but the sweetness there seems false in some way. But then there is that prayer scene that you identified is really pretty marvelous, and also is seems to be kind of the thing that gets us into the space at the end. From those who serve different gods, and then oh, which is in jammed, so that's a bold move. Oh clement, oh loving, oh God, amidst ruins, amidst waters, fleeing, and then there's italicized, deliver us from evil, oh sweet, oh sweet. In those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 lines, there's 9 O's. The speaker is taking the words from this thing that she has been pressed upon her. I mean, it's sort of a literal repurposing or reclaiming of language, and then sort of turning it by just sheer rhythm and word magic into something that sort of works for her, or can deliver her into the place at the end where she can say, let us eat what makes us holy. Yeah, I don't know. I guess now that I say that, I don't know how that carries into the gender aspect of it, but certainly that does seem to be the fundamental lyrical element that is creating the turn from the first into the second into the third section.
Yeah, I also don't know that I have a real straight or sure-footed idea of how that particular section plays into the gender movements within the poem. But it is, as you noted, a really interesting lyrical interlude. I like that it switches from italics to non-italics to italics again, because it makes me wonder if it's one long, almost internal conversation that starts happening, and are the non-italicized parts the thought process that goes on while saying one of these prayers, or is it a mixture of the initial prayer and then almost like it would be a montage in a film of a lot of time passing and thinking about this subject and cogitating on it, because you have that section in this country which calls itself Christian, what is sweeter than hearing, and then italicized, have mercy on us, which you could hear from any population that has come to, I'm assuming in this instance it means the United States, but any immigrant population that came to the United States and found themselves othered, which would be basically every immigrant population that's come to the United States, and has to sort of beseech this patriarchal power structure, have mercy on us. And then in some very twisted instances, has to literally say, as is the next italicized bit, deliver us from evil. That evil being the patriarchal oppression that the country itself has put upon them, but that the oppressed population is still constantly asked to continue asking permission to be delivered from, as opposed to having any sort of like agency or understanding on the part of larger power structures of what the like pernicious effects of those power structures are. So in some ways, I think it is a very powerful couple of statements about the position of new arrivals in the United States, which I think is particularly powerful right now, where all levels of activity by like anyone who is an immigrant or who would visually look like they may have immigrated, who is not someone who can pass as white right now, it's become so particularly difficult.
It reminds me of, there's this book I've started reading called Witnessing, which is by Kelly Oliver. It's kind of like, it's an academic sort of theoretical text, but it's trying to think about witnessing in a new way. But one of the problems that it identifies with sort of like contemporary or like current discourse about things is that the ultimate goal often is framed in terms of being recognized. So like civil rights movements have been framed around like, you know, we are equal citizens in America and deserve all of the rights that everyone else gets and white people get or straight people get or whatever. So you need to recognize us as equal under the law. But the one problem that Oliver identifies with that is that the powerful entity still is the one who bestows the recognition. So in the context of this, you were sort of talking about how the speaker is sort of reframing that deliver us from evil in the way that immigrant populations are asked, you know, to be often assimilated. And in that way, they're kind of like asking to be recognized as the same as everyone else or whatever. And in a similar way to be sort of delivered from whatever evil that doesn't actually exist, but that sort of the oppressive structure, whatever. But in that request, the powerful still are the one who bestows either the deliverance or the recognition. And so that seems to be really important, especially at the end of this poem, where the speaker is like, well, on the one hand, if a word for religion they don't believe in is magic, so it's like if they're not going to like recognize us and just call us whatever they're going to call us, then let us have that. We'll have magic. And then like let us have our own things, you know, our own mothers, scarves, spirits, and let us keep our stars to ourselves, which sort of refers back to the moment in this country, point at the moon, at the stars, point at the way the lake lies with a handful of feathers. So there's almost an image of the speaker or someone theoretically, like if you're like, well, look how beautiful that is, and you're pointing to the stars, and you're in that pointing, you're sort of asking for someone to recognize what you've pointed at and be like, yes, that is indeed beautiful or whatever, but instead, you know, are looking at your hand that's doing the pointing and saying it's full of feathers and then they're going to kill you or something. And so the speaker says, let us just keep our stars to ourselves. So we're no longer going to sort of like ask for recognition from this they or the powerful. And so it does seem to be a movement, you know, away from that ask of recognition, which is, I think, participating in some contemporary, sort of newer contemporary paradigms. There was a critique of the gay marriage movement from the left and from like LGBTQ people, in that marriage was an ask for recognition that they are the same as or something. And also the other part was that marriage equality is not the greatest problem facing many people who are queer. But the critique was kind of like, we shouldn't be like asking just for the same things that the powerful people have that we don't, but rather we should be doing something like making something new that doesn't have those same structures in place. And it feels like a little bit like this poem is trying to carve out a similar kind of imaginative space.
Definitely, particularly towards that last bit, as you were pointing out, very much it is talking about, let us have our own things and let that be enough. We'll pray to no one. We will pray for ourselves. And that also sort of reframes the whole prayer section as being in some way directed at those original women that the speaker did not believe in. But I really like all of that because it does point to where this comes and lands at the end, which is let us eat what makes us holy, which is such a powerful act of internalization. If you're eating it, it's becoming part of you. You become one with it. You really are in touch with and the same as and made up of whatever this substance of holiness is. And it literally sustains and energizes you like food would if you're eating it and taking it in. Plus, it is the opposite of speaking. Speaking, you're letting something out of your mouth, and eating, you're bringing it in. And so in a poem titled Say Grace, which does include a prayer said to, as we called out, women I did not believe in, this is in every way the opposite of that. And that a different way of saying grace is really taking in and internalizing and synthesizing your being with the parts of a tradition that make you who you are, rather than looking for that external validation or trying to bring it into harmony with this oppressive force that in the world of the poem, and basically always in the real world, is not interested in taking those parts into itself. It's interested in how can we change those things to be more in line with what we have in place.
Yeah, I love it. I love thinking about eating versus speaking that way. That's so right. And it's interesting because this is like a less substantial comment, but it's interesting to me personally how there's like very little eating or food in the poem before that moment. I think almost nothing. And personally, I would, in my own poems, trying to like somehow subtly set up my connotative meanings that I'm going to throw in at the end. And so I would be writing this like, we've got this dinner scene that doesn't seem to be about anything, or like we're talking about food, da 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 da. And then at the end, if I'm saying let us eat what makes us holy, you've sort of already been imbued. But this poem does not do that.
Or what I was thinking is that maybe earlier on there's a communion scene, because there is ingesting in the Catholic tradition. There is the transubstantiation. That's eating, that's consuming what theoretically is holy. So there could be something along those lines, but no, there isn't.
Yeah, and I think that it works well in that way. Well, it just introduces a totally new element at the end, a totally new way of being or thinking about this stuff. And so in a poem that is interested in carving out a new space and is interested in avoiding, what has been given to them, to sort of bring in eating or this whole image at the end makes some kind of sense there. It's also, it helps that it's common enough in a figurative way because it has the like transubstantiation and other ways that eating sort of has figurative moments that it doesn't like take us off guard. It's not like a crazy jump, but it is notable that it's like the last sentence, this two last lines, and it's sort of making a figurative statement on something that hasn't existed in the poem before.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, eating hasn't specifically shown up, but it does feel like it's maybe the ultimate iteration of the idea of the, doing something for yourself.
No, yeah, I love that way of thinking about internalizing and consuming versus speaking out and sort of in doing so asking for validation or whatever. The only other thing is that I just really like the line, until white people brought an ecstasy of rosaries and our cities today glow with crosses like graveyards. I love that line because glow and then crosses and then graveyards is so great. Because glow is like, well, it's like visual, but it's like also kind of cool, but it's also sort of eerie. And then crosses is referring to not crosses on graveyards, but just like the proliferation of Christ in Catholic like necklaces or crosses everywhere, etc. But the like graveyards is just that like just the foreboding and the grim connotation of like what this imposition of Christianity has sort of done for the cities.
For sure. And though it says crosses and not crucifixes, I think it also brings to mind, because of the context, crucifixes and the profusion of images of the dead or bleeding Christ that Catholicism and Christianity tend to bring in their wake. So I think along the lines of graveyards, there's just a lot of images of dead and injured bodies that go along with that religious tradition. I think the last thing I want to pull out is just that I really like the reference of scarves at the end, because, as I said, it puts me in mind of headscarves, hijabs in Islam, and that's something that's been targeted in Western societies, both by those on the right and the left. And I think that that is a powerful connection to ways in which all elements of these societies try to reject certain religious practices which have been otherized in these societies. So you have, like in France, a highly secular society tries to ban head coverings because, they want to keep religion out of the public square so intensely. And then you have conservatives in the United States who take a very similar line. And you have this meeting of both left and right, both of whom end up imposing certain views on another cultural practice. Again, I don't know for sure that's what the scarves is referring to, but at least that's where I sort of go with it when I read this piece. I think that's it. Shall we do it again?
I think we should.
All right. Say grace. In my country, our shamans were women and our gods multiple, until white people brought an ecstasy of rosaries, and our cities today glow with crosses like graveyards. As a child in Sunday school, I was told I'd go to hell if I didn't believe in God. Our teacher was a woman whose daughters wanted to be nuns. And I asked, what about babies? And what about Buddha? And she said, they're in hell too. And so I memorized prayers and recited them in front of women I did not believe in. Deliver us from evil, O sweet Virgin Mary, amen. O sweet, O sweet. In this country which calls itself Christian, what is sweeter than hearing, have mercy on us? From those who serve different gods, O clement, O loving, O God amidst ruins, amidst waters, fleeing, fleeing, deliver us from evil. O sweet, O sweet. In this country, point at the moon, at the stars, point at the way the lake lies with a handful of feathers, and they will look at the feathers and kill you for it. If a word for religion they don't believe in is magic, so be it. Let us have magic. Let us have our own mothers and scarves, our spirits, our shamans, and our sacred books. Let us keep our stars to ourselves, and we shall pray to no one. Let us eat what makes us holy.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? Get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.